23 lost British money tricks from the 1970s that still work today. Before you could count it, you knew where it went. You knew the envelope on the shelf and what it was not for. You knew the tin at the back of the cupboard was not for today. You knew a receipt was kept. You knew the jar was not touched once it was full. You knew the divvy number before you knew the alphabet. You knew the passbook lived in the drawer. None of it was taught. It came off the kitchen counter into your hands before you knew what hands were for. 23 habits, all real, all gone quiet. Section 1. The Jam Jar System. Friday evening had a particular weight to it in a British working household in the 1970s. And you could feel that weight even as a child without fully understanding why. There was something about the way an adult came through the door or sat down at the kitchen table that signaled a kind of business was about to happen. A small brown envelope sat on the table, or sometimes in a jacket pocket. It was your parents' pay packet, and it was the beginning of a weekly ritual that required no ceremony and no explanation. Because it had been happening in that kitchen, or one very like it, for as long as anyone could remember. What happened next is what this section is about. The money came out of the envelope, and it went into jars. This was the jam jar system. And for millions of British households through the 1970s, it was not a budgeting method in any formal sense. Nobody called it a system. It had no name on the shelf of a bookshop, and no column in a personal finance magazine. It was simply how money worked. You divided what you had into what you owed, and you kept each portion separate, so you always knew exactly where you stood. The jars sat in a line on the kitchen windowsill, or on a shelf in the larder, or along the back of a sideboard, each one labelled in pencil or marker, or sometimes just understood by everyone in the house through long habit. One for rent, one for the electric, one for gas, one for coal, one for the weekly food shop. Whatever was left, if anything was left, went into a final jar that might be called housekeeping, or might have no label at all, which was in itself a kind of label. The jars were real jam jars, Bon Maman or Robertson's, or whatever came off the shelf at the corner shop, washed out and given a second life. Some households used old tins. Some used envelopes lined up in a drawer. A few used a partitioned wooden box that had been knocked together by someone's father or grandfather from scrap timber, each compartment serving the same purpose as a jar. The vessel didn't matter. The discipline was the same in every house. When one jar was empty, that category was finished until next Friday. You did not borrow from the electric jar to cover the food jar. You did not raid the rent jar under any circumstances whatsoever, because rent was the one bill you could not talk your way out of. The jars made this rule physical rather than theoretical. You could not spend money you could not see, and if you could see a jar was empty, no rationalization was going to refill it. The reason this system worked so well in the 1970s was inseparable from the reason money arrived in a small brown envelope in the first place. At the start of the decade, the majority of British workers were still paid in cash weekly at the end of the working week. According to data later compiled by banking researchers, as late as 1976, 58% of wages in the United Kingdom were paid in physical cash. That weekly envelope was a complete and finite object. You could hold it in your hand. You could tip it out on the table and count it. And because you could count it, you could divide it. And because you could divide it, you could see in real time whether your week was going to work out or whether something had to give. The clarity this produced was not comfortable, but it was honest. If the food jar was looking thin by Wednesday, you knew by Wednesday, not at the end of the month when a bank statement arrived. Adjustments happened immediately and in proportion to what the jar told you. A tin of corned beef instead of mince, a smaller bag of coal, one less packet of biscuits. The jar communicated in a language that left no room for wishful thinking. There was no smoothing mechanism, no overdraft buffer quietly absorbing the overspend and presenting it to you at a distance. The jar said what it said, and you listened. There was a social code layered on top of the practical one. In most households, the jar system was the domain of the woman of the house, not because men could not do it, but because in most working families of that era, the management of household money was understood to be a female responsibility, regardless of who earned it. A man might hand over his pay packet intact on a Friday evening, and a woman would divide it. Or she might receive a housekeeping sum and manage everything within it. Either way, the jars were hers to tend. The skill involved in making a week's wages cover a week's expenses without leaving any category short was genuine and considerable, and it was almost never acknowledged as such, because it was simply what you did. Managing the jars well was ordinary. Letting a jar run out through carelessness was a failure worth talking about. Nobody had to explain that rule either. The system began to erode in the late 1970s and through the 1980s for reasons that had nothing to do with the system's effectiveness and everything to do with how wages arrived. BACS, the Bankers Automated Clearing Services framework, had been established in Britain in 1968, and through the following decade, more and more employers began switching from cash pay packets to direct transfers into bank accounts. By 1981, the share of wages paid in cash had fallen from that 58% figure down to 42%. Monthly salaries replaced weekly wages for a growing portion of the workforce. At the same time, utility companies began offering and then quietly insisting on direct debit arrangements, which meant the gas bill and the electric bill and the rent left your account automatically, without the intervention of a jar or an envelope, or any visible act of allocation at all. Once the money became a number on a statement rather than a count of notes and coins on a kitchen table, the jar system had no foundation left to stand on. You cannot divide an invisible wage into physical containers. The discipline the jars had enforced was a discipline made possible by cash. And as cash moved to the margins of daily financial life, the jars went with it. By the time most British households had settled into monthly direct deposits and automatic bill payments sometime in the middle of the 1980s, the practice had largely ended without anyone formally deciding to stop it. What remained was what the practice had always produced: a household where every pound was accounted for before it was spent, where the boundaries between categories were hard rather than soft, and where running out in one area did not automatically mean borrowing from another. Those outcomes are available to anyone now. The jar does not need to be a physical jar. A separate savings pot in the mobile banking app works on exactly the same principle. Some British banks now market a digital version of this under the phrase Jam Jar account, offered primarily by credit unions and aimed at customers who have difficulty with traditional budgeting tools. The Money Helper service run by the government still describes the method in detail on its website and recommends it as a practical starting point for anyone struggling to make income meet outgoings. The jars are gone. The logic inside them has not gone anywhere. You knew without counting that a jar was getting low because you could simply see it. The next trick worked on a completely different principle. One where the saving happened almost without your noticing it at all. One small stamp at a time. Section 2. Green Shield stamps. Somewhere in the house there was an orange book. It lived in a kitchen drawer, or on the shelf above the telephone, or in a handbag that never quite got emptied out properly. The cover had a green shield printed on it, and the inside pages were printed with small rectangular outlines, each one the exact size of a tiny gummed paper square. Filling those outlines was a project that could last weeks, and when you were a child old enough to help, the job of pressing the stamps into their spaces with a damp sponge was genuinely satisfying, in the way that repetitive, orderly tasks can be when you are young and the outcome is visible and immediate. The book grew heavier. The outlines disappeared. Something was coming, eventually, and you knew it. Green Shield stamps were introduced to Britain in 1958 by a businessman named Richard Tompkins, who had seen a version of the same scheme operating in America under the Sperry and Hutchinson name, and recognised that British shoppers would take to it with equal enthusiasm. The basic mechanics were simple enough. Every time you spent sixpence at a participating retailer, you received one stamp. The stamps went home in your pocket, and at home they went into the Orange Stamp Saver Book, which held 1,280 stamps in total. Fill a book, and you had recorded a purchase total of exactly £32 worth of shopping. The book could then be exchanged at a Green Shield redemption centre for goods chosen from a catalogue, with no cash changing hands at any point in the transaction. By the middle of the 1960s, this scheme had become something close to a national habit. Tesco signed up with Green Shield in 1963, not long after its main competitor, FineFare, had adopted a rival scheme called S&H Pink Stamps. And Tesco's scale meant that millions of British shoppers were suddenly collecting on their weekly grocery run, whether they had planned to or not. Petrol stations joined, corner shops joined. At its peak, around half the adult population of Britain was saving Green Shield stamps, according to figures cited in trade press of the era. The catalogue offered a range that started with small domestic items and climbed steadily upward. A Kenwood Chef food mixer, one of the aspirational kitchen objects of the period, required just over 33 full books. A Regentone 19-inch television set cost 88 books, which represented a cumulative grocery spend of around £2,800 at sixpence per stamp. Nobody said this out loud, but that figure made the stamp scheme a remarkably patient form of saving, one that accumulated invisibly inside the ordinary rhythm of shopping, rather than requiring any deliberate act of putting money aside. That invisibility was the point. You were not budgeting, you were not sacrificing anything. You were simply going to the shops you were already going to and keeping the small pieces of paper the cashier handed back with your change. The discipline required was close to zero, and the reward was eventual and tangible, and arrived in the form of something you had specifically chosen from a catalogue. It felt less like a financial strategy and more like a slow, pleasant game. Families kept their books in different states of completion. Some households had one book on the go at a time. Others had several open simultaneously, filling them from different participating outlets. The books themselves were free, dispensed at any shop in the scheme, and there was a minor recurring pleasure in starting a fresh one and watching the first few pages fill. The licking was part of the experience in a way that is harder to describe than it should be. Each stamp had a gummed back, of the type common to postage stamps of the era, and pressing it to the tip of your tongue produced a faintly sweet, faintly chemical flavour that was not pleasant exactly, but was associated so strongly with the ritual of filling the book that it became its own small reward. More careful households kept a damp cloth or sponge beside the book to wet the stamps without touching them directly. Either way, the physical act of placing the stamp in its outline, pressing it flat, and moving on to the next one was a domestic ritual, with a satisfying, almost meditative quality that no digital points scheme has ever managed to replicate. The decline came from two directions at once in the mid-1970s. The oil crisis of 1973 pushed inflation sharply higher across the British economy, reaching a peak of around 25% annually by 1975. At that level of price increase, the purchasing power of a completed stamp book was eroding faster than most households could fill one, which quietly undermined the whole proposition. At the same time, a new style of cut-price grocery retailer was arriving, led by QuickSave, that competed entirely on price rather than peripheral incentives. Tesco responded in 1977 by launching what its management called Operation Checkout, a major price-cutting initiative designed to match the discounters. Abandoning Green Shield stamps was central to the plan, saving the company an estimated £20 million a year that could be redirected into lower shelf prices. Once Tesco withdrew, the scheme lost its most important partner, and the rest of the retail network followed quickly. Tomkins had already seen this coming, and had been converting Green Shield's redemption centres into a new retail format since 1973. The first rebranded location opened that year in Canterbury, operating under a name drawn from a list of classical references. Argos. The catalogue and collection model that Greenshield had pioneered was preserved inside the new brand, even as the stamps themselves faded from use. They were formally withdrawn in 1991, though uncollected books survived in drawers for decades afterward. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The stamps worked because the saving felt like nothing at all. A stamp here, a book there, until one day there was enough for something real. The next trick ran on the opposite logic entirely. You handed money over deliberately every single week to a person who came to your door, and what you got back at the end of the year was the point. Section 3. The Christmas Club. Sometime in January, while the decorations were still coming down, there would be a knock at the door. The person standing on the step was not a stranger. She lived 3 streets away, or she worked at the same factory, or she was someone your mother had known since school. She had a small book with her, she wrote your name in it, and you agreed on an amount, and from that point until November, she came back every week and collected whatever you had pledged, a shilling, half a crown, whatever the budget allowed. She noted it in her book, and you noted it in yours, and that was the Christmas Club, and nobody who was part of one ever had to scramble in December. The Door-to-Door Savings Club was one of the most quietly effective financial tools that ever existed in working-class Britain, and it operated almost entirely on trust and personal connection. The agent was not a bank employee and not a professional financial advisor. She was a neighbor, collecting from a list of families she knew personally, carrying their money home to count on a kitchen table before forwarding it on, and taking back a small percentage in vouchers or hamper goods as her own compensation for the time. The scheme she worked for might be a local arrangement run from a corner shop or a church hall. It might be a national operation. By the 1970s, the largest of these was an organization whose origins traced back to 1935, when a small Christmas savings operation had begun in Peckham, South London, and by 1969 had grown to 500 agents collecting across the country. By the time the decade was properly underway, that same business was running tens of thousands of agents and serving hundreds of thousands of families, delivering hampers of food and household goods every November to customers who had been paying in since the previous January. The hamper itself was the object that made the whole thing feel real. It came in a cardboard box or a wicker basket, depending on how much you had saved, and it contained things that a British household of the 1970s used at Christmas. Tinned ham, Christmas pudding, a tin of biscuits, instant coffee, tea, perhaps a bottle of something. The contents were chosen from a catalogue, and browsing that catalogue was itself a pleasure extended across most of the year. The catalogue arrived in February or March, and families kept it in the drawer with the seed catalogues and the Freeman's clothing book, and they looked through it on evenings when there was nothing on television, and made lists of what they might order when the time came. The anticipation was a real part of the value, even before a penny had been saved. What made the system work financially was the same thing that made the jam jar system work. Your access to the money was structurally prevented. You could not raid the Christmas fund because you had already given it to someone else. Your agent held it, or the company held it through her, and it would not come back to you in any form you could spend until the hamper landed on the doorstep in November. For families living on tight weekly budgets through an era of serious inflation, this forced separation between intention and access was genuinely protective. British inflation reached over 20% in 1975, and the pressure on household incomes was acute enough that any money left in a household account or a jar at home was money that could be justified away by 100 small emergencies before December arrived. The agent removed that possibility entirely. You had pledged, she had collected, and Christmas was handled. The social architecture was as important as the financial one. Your agent was accountable to you in the way that a bank branch was not, because she lived nearby and you would see her at the post office or the school gate if something went wrong. That accountability ran in both directions. You did not miss a payment casually, because missing a payment meant telling your agent face to face, and your agent was someone you respected and did not want to disappoint. The weekly collection at the door was a small ritual of commitment, a moment where you physically transferred money rather than watching a number change on a statement. And that physicality made it feel binding in a way that a direct debit simply does not replicate. The principle the club ran on was one of the oldest and most robust in the history of informal finance. A group of people who could not individually save enough for a large expense could collectively ensure that each member arrived at that expense prepared by pooling the discipline of commitment and the enforcement of social obligation, rather than relying on individual willpower alone. Rotating savings clubs operating on exactly this logic had existed across Africa, the Caribbean, and South Asia for generations before British Christmas clubs formalized a version of it. And those international equivalents, known as susu, chit funds, and tontines depending on the community, were operating in British immigrant communities throughout the 1970s alongside the mainstream hamper schemes. The formal club model began to decline in the 1980s as credit cards became widely available and supermarket loyalty schemes offered new ways to spread the cost of Christmas gradually. The catastrophic collapse of Fairpack in October 2006, which left around 150,000 families out of pocket for an estimated £37 million they had saved through the year, effectively ended public trust in the model as a whole. What it did not end was the underlying principle. Hand your money to a mechanism that removes your ability to touch it until you actually need it. Every locked savings pot and every no-withdrawal Christmas account offered by a credit union today runs on that exact logic. The agent at the door is gone. The discipline she enforced is available in about 30 seconds through a mobile banking app. You gave your money away once a week and trusted it would come back as something better. The next trick asked you to trust a completely different kind of institution entirely, one with a very specific kind of book, and a queue on a Saturday morning that told you exactly how much your street valued the future over the present. Section 4. The Building Society Passbook. The book was small enough to fit in a coat pocket, and most people who owned one kept it somewhere specific and permanent. A drawer in the kitchen, a tin on the sideboard, the inside pocket of a handbag that was only brought out on serious occasions. It was covered in a plain card that carried the name of the institution and the account number in small, careful print. Inside, the pages were ruled into columns: date, deposit, withdrawal, balance. Each time you went in and handed over your money, a teller on the other side of a wooden counter would take the book, stamp it, and write the new entry in ink that was often purple or dark blue, precise and slightly formal. The same color and weight of script no matter which branch you visited. The book came back across the counter and you put it in your pocket, and your savings were real in a way that a number on a screen has never quite managed to replicate. This was the Building Society Passbook, and on a Saturday morning in a British town of any size in the 1970s, the queue to have one updated often stretched past the door. The queue was its own kind of social fact. You stood in it next to people from your street, people from work, older women in good coats who had been coming to the same counter since before the branch manager was born. The Building Society was not a bank. That distinction mattered, and people who used one understood it without necessarily being able to articulate it precisely. A bank was a place that held your money and lent it to businesses. A building society was a place that held your money, paid you interest on it, and lent it to other members so they could buy houses. You were not a customer. You were a member, with a formal stake in the institution, entitled to a vote at the annual general meeting, even if almost nobody ever attended one. The structure ran on mutual obligation rather than profit extraction, and in practice that meant the interest rates offered to savers were consistently better than anything the clearing banks provided. At the peak of the system, in 1910, there were 1,723 building societies operating across Britain. Just about every town of any size had one named after it. The Halifax Permanent Benefit Building Society had been established in West Yorkshire in 1852 as a loan and investment society specifically for working people with surplus cash, and no obvious place to put it. The Woolwich Equitable, the Leeds Permanent, the Bradford and Bingley, the Cheltenham and Gloucester. These were local, recognizable, deliberately unintimidating institutions whose entire architecture of language and presentation was designed to make ordinary savers feel welcome rather than assessed. By the 1970s, the Woolwich was running a television advertising campaign whose central phrase was simple enough to become genuinely famous across the country. It did not promise extraordinary returns or complex products. It simply named the relationship. You were with them, they were with you. The passbook made this concrete. Unlike a bank statement that arrived by post once a month and summarized the past in numbers that felt like a report on someone else's decisions, the passbook was updated in real time at the point of transaction and handed back immediately. Your balance was there in ink before you had left the counter. If you were saving towards something, a holiday, a new piece of furniture, a deposit on a house, the progress was visible and cumulative and permanent in a way that had genuine psychological weight. The book itself accumulated history. Entries from years earlier sat in the same binding as entries from this morning. A parent who opened an account for a child at birth and kept contributing to it could hand the book over years later as a document of time as much as money. The number in the balance column representing not just capital, but patience made visible. The Saturday morning ritual of the Building Society deposit was also a piece of social training that few people would have described as such. You brought children, they watched. Some building societies offered children's accounts, specifically designed to build the habit early, complete with their own smaller passbooks and marketing campaigns aimed at young savers. The Abbey National ran a scheme called Tell a Story that gave children illustrated booklets alongside their savings record. The Halifax had a children's account whose passbooks were filled with entries made in the same purple ink as the adult ones, taken just as seriously at the counter by the same tellers. A child who had stood in that Saturday queue often enough would carry the habit of regular small deposits into adulthood, without ever consciously deciding to. That was the point. And it worked. The model began to unravel with the Building Societies Act of 1986, which, for the first time, permitted building societies to demutualize, to abandon their mutual structure, convert to public limited companies, and list on the stock exchange. The Abbey National went first in 1989. Between that year and 2000, 10 major societies converted, including the Halifax, the Woolwich, the Alliance and Leicester, and the Bradford and Bingley. Members received free shares in the new companies as compensation for the mutual rights they were surrendering. And the short-term windfall was large enough that investors began opening accounts at any remaining mutual society specifically to qualify for the next conversion vote, a practice that came to be called carpetbagging. Of the 10 societies that converted to banks in that period, not one survived as an independent organization. Every single one was eventually merged, acquired, or collapsed. The 42 societies that chose to remain mutual are still operating today, and in 2023 they paid their savers £2.1 billion more in interest than those savers would have received from the large banks at their average rates. The passbook is gone from most of them. The logic that produced it has not changed at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Your savings grew slowly, visibly, in ink you could read on a Saturday morning. The next trick worked on an entirely different kind of patience, one that had nothing to do with money going in and everything to do with being extremely careful about what you let come out. Section 5. The Household Account Book. Somewhere in the house, usually a drawer in the kitchen or a shelf within easy reach of wherever the bills were kept, there was a small notebook. Sometimes it was a purpose-made account book bought from a stationer, with printed columns already ruled across the pages. More often, it was an ordinary school exercise book, the kind with a soft card cover in marbled green or red, which had been repurposed for household finance, and would last a year before being replaced with another. The columns were drawn in pencil by whoever kept the book, usually the same hand every time, usually the same width and spacing. The kind of repetitive precision that comes from doing the same task every week for years without variation. At the top of each page, a date. Down the left margin, what had gone out. In the column beside it, how much. At the bottom, a total. That total was the number the week was judged against. This was the household account book, and in British working-class households of the 1970s, it was one of the most quietly powerful financial tools in existence. Its power was not in what it enabled you to do, it was in what it made impossible to avoid. When every expenditure from the week's shopping to the gas bill to a new pair of school shoes for a child had to be written down and totaled at the end of the week, there was no mechanism left for self-deception. The total either matched what you had available or it did not. If it did not, you could see exactly why, and in exactly which category the problem had appeared. And that knowledge was cold and specific and impossible to argue with, in the way that a vague unease about money can always be argued with. The book was precise. Precision was the point. The practice had deep roots in British domestic life. Frugality guides from the Victorian era advised households to maintain written records of income and expenditure as a basic discipline of respectable management, and the habit had filtered down through the following generations, partly through instruction and partly through watching. A daughter who grew up in a household where her mother sat down every Friday or Saturday morning with the book and the week's receipts would find herself doing the same thing as a matter of course rather than deliberate decision. The knowledge transferred without being formally taught, which is exactly how the most durable domestic habits always travel. By the 1970s, the practice was being conducted against a backdrop of significant financial pressure. British inflation reached around 25% annually in 1975, which meant that the prices being recorded in the account book were rising fast enough that last month's column was already out of date as a guide to this month's spending. Households that tracked their expenditure carefully had a critical advantage. They could see in real time where the inflation was hitting hardest, which categories were rising fastest, and where adjustments needed to be made before the weekly total exceeded the weekly income. A family that could see in its account book that food costs had risen by a third in 6 months was a family that could make deliberate choices about substitution and reduction. A family that did not track was finding out the same information only at the point where there was nothing left. The social rule attached to the account book was similar to the one attached to the jam jar system and the building society passbook. It was maintained by the woman of the house. It was private, and managing it well was a competence that was expected without being acknowledged. A documented example from a working-class English family whose account book survives as a historical record through the 1950s and into the 1960s, shows the categories that appeared week after week: food, rent or mortgage, fuel, clothing, insurance, savings, fares, and what the book called sundries, a category that covered anything small enough not to warrant its own column, but too significant to leave unrecorded. Television rental appeared for the first time in 1959, squeezed into a small space at the top of the list as though its keeper were uncertain where exactly this new expense belonged. The book grew around the life the household was actually living, adjusting its categories as needs changed, never missing a week. The physical discipline involved was part of what made the system work. You had to keep the receipts. You had to find them at the end of the week, which meant establishing a place where receipts went and using that place consistently. You had to sit down and do the arithmetic by hand. None of these steps is demanding in isolation, but together they created a weekly moment of financial reckoning that was impossible to skip without the absence being immediately felt. The book sat there. The receipts sat with it. The blank column was its own kind of pressure. The system began to lose its footing in the 1980s as bank statements became monthly documents delivered to the door rather than something you went to a branch to obtain, and as more transactions moved onto cards rather than cash. By the 1990s, the bank statement was doing a version of the account book's job automatically, and the convenience of this was real enough that most households stopped maintaining their own parallel record. What the bank statement did not do, and still does not do, was force you to sit down and engage with the numbers at regular intervals. The statement arrived and went into a file. The account book had to be filled in. That difference is significant. Research into household financial behavior consistently shows that people who actively engage with their spending records, as opposed to passively receiving them, have materially better outcomes in terms of debt reduction and savings accumulation. The book made engagement unavoidable. The statement made it optional, and most people chose the easier path. Every penny that left the house was named and noted and totaled, and the total told you everything you needed to know about the week. The next trick worked at the other end of the same problem. Not in the notebook, but in the shop itself, at the moment the decision was actually being made. Section 6. The end-of-day market. An hour before the stalls came down, the voice of the trader changed. Earlier in the day it had been a performance, loud and rhythmic, projecting across the square to pull browsers in from 20 feet away. In the last hour, it became something else. Lower, faster, directed at anyone already close enough to hear, carrying a number that had not existed at noon and would not exist again next Saturday. £1 for the lot. Take the tray. Half price on whatever's left. The words came quickly because the clock was the whole point. Every unsold cabbage or pork chop or bunch of tulips that was still on the table when the trader started packing down was a cabbage he had hauled in and would have to haul out again. And a trader who had been on his feet since 6 in the morning had limited enthusiasm for that prospect. You knew this, and the timing of your arrival was not accidental. Shopping the end of the market was a skill as specific as any other. And in British towns and cities through the 1970s, it was practiced by a significant portion of the population who would never have described it as a strategy, because it was simply how certain households approached a Saturday. Britain's tradition of market towns ran deep, with records of formal trading markets in most sizable settlements reaching back to charters granted in the medieval period. And by the mid-20th century, those weekly or twice-weekly markets were still a central feature of how working families provisioned themselves. The fruit and vegetable stall, the butcher's stall, the bread stall, these were not picturesque heritage attractions, but active competitors with the emerging supermarkets. And in the 1970s, when inflation was running at rates that made last week's prices feel historical, the difference between buying at midday and buying at 4 o'clock in the afternoon could be genuinely significant. The mechanism was simple and rational on both sides. Market traders dealing in perishable goods had no refrigerated storage to fall back on, and no economical way to transport unsold stock back to wherever it had come from in good enough condition to sell again next week. The calculus at the end of the day was therefore not whether to reduce prices, but how far to reduce them, since any money recovered on unsold stock was better than the zero recovered by packing it into a bin at the end of the day. A shopper who arrived in the final hour was not exploiting the trader. She was solving a logistical problem the trader was very motivated to have solved. The social choreography around this was understood by both parties and required no explanation. Regulars did not arrive conspicuously early and hover, which would have been considered rude and would have irritated the trader enough to make him less generous when the time came. They arrived at the right moment and made their interest clear without appearing desperate, because appearing desperate reduced your leverage in a transaction that was, at its core, still a negotiation. A trader who could see that 3 women were interested in the same tray of tomatoes did not necessarily knock the price down as far as he would if only one person was waiting. That knowledge was applied automatically and without drama, because everyone present understood the terms. What you came home with at the end of a late market Saturday had a character that midday shopping could not replicate. The vegetables were not imperfect exactly, but they were riper than what had moved earlier in the day, which meant they were better for cooking that evening and worse for keeping until Thursday. The bread was the day's baking rather than something held back. The fish was whatever had not been chosen first. The constraint this placed on the household kitchen was real. You cooked what you had bought, rather than buying what you had planned to cook. For households that operated this way as a matter of course, the flexibility was simply part of how food worked. The practice faded as supermarkets extended their hours and their footprint through the 1980s and 1990s, offering refrigerated aisles and consistent pricing at any hour of any day. A supermarket had no end-of-day problem, because it had the cold storage the market trader lacked. And its pricing structure gave nothing away in the final hour. The specific opportunity the market's closing time created simply did not exist in the fluorescent aisles of a Tesco or Asda. What remained, and still remains, is the principle. Know when the incentives of the person selling something align with yours, and be present at that moment rather than at any other. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The market told you when prices would fall, if you were patient enough to wait. The next trick worked on the same idea of timing, but it had nothing to do with markets, and the thing being preserved was not food. Section 7. Buying a season ahead. March was when you bought the winter coat, not because March was coat weather, but because March was when the coat cost half what it had cost in November. And the difference between those two prices was real money that the household needed for other things. The coat would go into the wardrobe. It would stay there through spring and summer and into the following autumn, waiting. And when the cold finally arrived again, it would still be there, still good, still exactly the right size, if you had bought carefully. And the money saved by purchasing it in the wrong season would be sitting quietly elsewhere, having done some other work in the months between. This was one of the most disciplined and least discussed money habits in British households of the 1970s. The systematic practice of buying goods a full season ahead of when you needed them, at clearance prices, and storing them until their moment came. It required a particular kind of forward thinking that ran against the grain of most shopping instincts, because the instinct is to buy what you need when you need it, not to buy in spring what you will not require until October. Overriding that instinct was the whole point, and in households where the trick was understood and practiced consistently, it produced savings that compounded quietly across an entire year's worth of seasonal goods. The British retail calendar made this possible in a way that was highly predictable and had been for generations. Department stores and high street drapers had been holding formal seasonal clearance sales since at least the late Victorian era, when clearing unsold stock at the end of each season was a standard part of the retail year. By the 1970s, the pattern was well established. Summer clothing and outdoor goods went on steep reduction from late July through August. Winter clothing, coats, boots, and heavy bedding were marked down sharply from January through February, with the deepest reductions arriving in the final weeks as retailers made room for spring stock. Marks & Spencer, British Home Stores, C&A, and the network of regional department stores that was still a significant presence on most British high streets, all followed versions of the same schedule. A shopper who understood that schedule held a structural advantage over one who did not. The savings were substantial enough to justify genuine planning. A winter coat that had retailed at full price in October could be purchased for 40 or 50% less in February. Wool blankets, school uniform items bought a size up, children's Wellington boots for next winter, bed linen, curtain fabric. All of these were available at clearance prices in the weeks immediately following the season they were designed for. At a period when British inflation reached around 25% annually at its 1975 peak, the ability to buy a coat in February and avoid buying the same coat in October at a price inflated by nearly a quarter was not a marginal consideration. It was a meaningful household decision. The habit required a specific kind of domestic organization beyond just the willingness to plan. You had to know what you would need. You had to estimate sizes for children who would be larger by October than they were in February. You had to have storage for goods that would not be used for months. And you had to have a small reserve of cash available in February that was earmarked specifically for this purpose and could not be absorbed by more immediate needs. That last requirement was the difficult one, and it is why the trick worked best in households that were already practicing some version of the jam jar system or the Building Society passbook. Households where money was already allocated in advance and protected from competing demands. The practice faded through the 1980s and accelerated its decline in the 1990s as the structure of British retail began to change fundamentally. Fast fashion introduced year-round new stock arrivals that made the traditional two-season clearance calendar increasingly irrelevant, since there was always something new to sell, and therefore less pressure to drastically reduce the old. Retailers also discovered that artificial sale events, promoted aggressively and timed to maximize footfall rather than to genuinely clear stock, were more profitable than deep seasonal clearances. Black Friday, imported from American retail practice and established firmly in Britain by the early 2000s, scattered the discount calendar across the year in ways that made the old seasonal rhythm impossible to predict or rely upon. The underlying principle has not changed. Out-of-season pricing still exists wherever a retailer is clearing genuine stock. A winter coat purchased in February still costs less than the same coat purchased in November. The maths that made this worth doing in 1974 makes it worth doing now. You bought next winter's coat while this winter was still finishing, and it sat in the wardrobe until it was needed. The next trick ran on entirely different logic, one that had nothing to do with patience or planning ahead, and everything to do with a jar, a habit, and the specific weight of a coin in the hand. Section 8. The loose change jar. Last thing at night, before the jacket went on the hook or the trousers were folded over the chair, the coins came out of the pocket. Not counted, not sorted, not deliberated over. Simply transferred from wherever they had accumulated during the day into whatever container lived on the mantelpiece or the windowsill or the top of the chest of drawers for exactly this purpose. An old OXO tin, a ceramic pot with a slot cut in the lid, sometimes an actual jar, the same kind that sat in the kitchen with a different label and a different purpose. The sound of the first coin hitting the bottom was distinct from the sound of a coin landing on a pile of other coins. And by the time the container was making that second sound, something useful was accumulating. This was not budgeted. It was not planned. It was not a savings scheme in any formal sense. It was simply the daily habit of treating loose change as categorically different from folding money. A mental distinction that had the practical effect of removing those coins from circulation within the household economy and allowing them to accumulate undisturbed for weeks or months at a time. The distinction required no discipline because it was not experienced as discipline. Coins that had already been moved from pocket to jar were not available for small impulse decisions in the same way that coins remaining in a pocket were. Out of reach, in the most literal sense, was out of mind. Britain had decimalized its currency on the 15th of February 1971, a date known formally as Decimal Day and less formally in the preceding press as D-Day, replacing the old system of pounds, shillings and pence with a straightforward division of 100 new pence to the pound. The new coins were unfamiliar in weight and size and feel, and a significant portion of the population spent the early years of the decade handling them with the slightly cautious attention of people who had not yet fully internalized their value. The 50 pence piece was a large seven-sided coin, one of the first heptagonal coins in the world, introduced in 1969 ahead of full decimalization to replace the old 10-shilling note. The 10 pence was substantial and silver-coloured. The 1 pence and 2 pence were large and copper. These were real objects with real weight, and that physical reality was part of what made the loose change habit work. A coin was something you could hold and hear and feel, and a jar full of coins was something you could lift and sense the increasing weight of over time. The psychological mechanism behind the habit has since been studied with some rigor. Research into what economists call the denomination effect shows consistently that people are significantly less willing to break a large denomination note than to spend the same amount in small change, treating the two as psychologically distinct categories of money, despite their identical face value. The loose change jar exploited this distinction deliberately. By physically moving coins out of the category of spendable currency and into the category of accumulating reserve, the habit created a savings process that felt like nothing at all, because it never required the decision to save. The coins had already been spent, in a sense. Whatever remained at the end of the day was surplus to the transactions of that day, and surplus was what went in the jar. A jar that received the daily pocket change of one adult for a year could accumulate a sum that surprised people even when they had been watching it fill for months. The specific value depended entirely on the denomination mix of whatever change the person typically handled. But households that made a point of directing 10 pence and 50 pence pieces into a separate container rather than mixing all coins together found the results more dramatic. Some households ran 2 jars, copper into one, silver into another. The silver jar was the serious one. By Christmas, it could hold enough for the children's gifts. By summer, it could fund a long weekend away. The habit began to dissolve as cash itself became optional rather than routine. Card payments were available in larger shops from the 1980s onward, and their penetration into everyday British retail accelerated sharply through the 1990s and 2000s. By 2019, card transactions outnumbered cash transactions in the United Kingdom for the first time. The pandemic of 2020 made contactless payment the default in a matter of months, with many retailers actively discouraging cash on hygiene grounds. A person who pays for everything by tapping a card produces no coins at the end of the day, and therefore has nothing to put in the jar. The habit requires physical money as its raw material, and physical money is now an exception rather than the texture of a normal day. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The jar filled without effort because the coins were already gone from your thinking before they left your pocket. The next trick worked on an identical principle, but applied it to something most people never thought to save at all. Section 9. The dripping basin. Sunday dinner produced two things that mattered in a British working household: the meat, which went on the table, and the fat, which went in the basin. The fat came out of the roasting tin at the end, poured off carefully while the joint rested, a pale liquid that smelled of everything the meat had given up during 3 hours in the oven. The basin was ceramic, usually a round glazed pot with a lid, and it sat somewhere near the stove, or in the larder, or later, in the lower shelf of the refrigerator. You poured the fat in while it was still hot. You put the lid on. You left it alone. By Monday morning, it had set into a layered structure, pale, almost white fat across the top, and beneath it a darker band of meat jelly that had separated downward as the whole thing cooled. Dense and savory, and just as useful in its own way as the fat above it. Nothing had been bought. Nothing had been spent. Something that would otherwise have gone down the sink had been transferred into a container, and over the following week it would do the work of a cooking fat and a bread spread and a flavouring for soups, at zero additional cost to the household. This was the dripping basin, and in British households of the 1970s it operated on exactly the same logic as the loose change jar. You were not saving anything. You were simply not throwing something away. The basin sat where it always sat, and the fat accumulated in it after every roast, and the accumulated fat reduced the weekly shopping bill in ways that were real but never itemized, because the dripping cost nothing and was simply there when you needed it. Removing it from your cooking would not have produced a sum you could point to and name, but its presence meant you were not buying cooking fat, or not buying as much butter for spreading, or not buying the beef stock you would otherwise have needed for the gravy. Britain's working-class relationship with dripping was old and deep enough to have produced a legal case in 1865 that ended in riots. A cook named Eliza Stafford was jailed for a month by her employer Henry Chorley for taking dripping from his kitchen with the intention of selling it. The working class of the period did not accept this quietly. Stafford's jailing sparked weeks of protest and a violent mob outside Chorley's residence on the day of her release. Because the custom of kitchen workers retaining the dripping from a household's cooking as a legitimate perquisite of their employment was so thoroughly established that criminalizing it felt like an attack on a recognized right. The dripping was not waste, it was a resource, and the question of who held the right to that resource was serious enough to take to the courts and then to the streets. By the 1970s, the dripping basin was no longer a political flashpoint, but it remained a fixture in households where the Sunday roast was the weekly anchor of the kitchen calendar. The technique for making it properly was passed down without being formally taught. You poured the fat off hot. You let it cool undisturbed. The jelly at the bottom was used in soups and gravies. The fat at the top was used for roasting potatoes, which it rendered crisp and golden in a way that vegetable oil never quite replicated, and for spreading on bread with a pinch of salt, which had been a standard snack and occasional meal for the British working class since at least the Victorian era. George Orwell, writing about the lowest rungs of London poverty in the early 1930s, recorded bread smeared with dripping as one of the cheapest things a person could eat and still feel that they had eaten something. The decline was driven by two forces, arriving roughly a decade apart. The first was the marketing of vegetable oils through the 1970s and into the 1980s as a healthier alternative to animal fats. A campaign built on emerging research linking saturated fat to heart disease that was at the time more confident than the underlying evidence quite warranted. The second was the BSE crisis of the late 1980s, when bovine spongiform encephalopathy destroyed British confidence in beef products generally, and the dripping basin along with them. Most households that had still been keeping one in 1985 had stopped by 1995. The Sunday roast persisted. The basin that used to follow it did not. The fat from a roasting tin still exists. It still comes off the same joint in the same kitchen at the end of the same meal. It still goes somewhere. In most households now, that somewhere is the drain. Every roast produced something worth keeping, and the basin was how you kept it. The next trick also turns something ordinary into something useful, but it happened earlier in the week, before any cooking had started at all. Section 10. The weekly bird. The decision happened at the butcher's counter, not in the kitchen. It happened on Thursday or Friday, when the week's shopping was done, and it was the decision to buy the whole bird rather than the portions, and to know before the purchase was made exactly what the bird was going to become over the following 4 or 5 days. The roasting joints and chops and mince were already in the basket. The chicken was the last thing, and it required a different kind of thinking from everything else. Because everything else was bought for one meal, and the chicken was being bought for several. You carried the planning in your head from the moment you handed over the money, and that planning was the trick. Chicken had arrived at this position in the British working-class kitchen through a specific and recent history. In the 1950s, it had been an expensive luxury, served at Christmas and at Easter, and at almost no other point in the domestic year. Production of broiler chickens in Britain stood at roughly 1 million birds annually in the early part of that decade. Small enough that a roast chicken at an ordinary household table remained an occasional event. In 1959, the first fast-processing poultry factory opened in Aldershot, importing intensive farming methods that had already transformed the American market. And the industrialization of British chicken production accelerated from that point. By 1965, the price of poultry had fallen by nearly a third. By the time the 1970s were properly underway, a whole roasting chicken had become attainable for working families on most budgets. But it had not yet become cheap enough to be careless with. A whole medium bird in the mid-1970s still cost the equivalent of over £11 in today's money, according to figures from the period. That was real expenditure, and it needed to do real work. The plan that a careful household ran from one bird could look something like this, though the specific meals varied by family and by what was in the larder. Sunday, the bird went into the oven and came out as the main meal of the week, served hot with potatoes and whatever vegetables the season offered. The carcass was not thrown away. Monday, the remaining cold meat came off the bones and became sandwiches for packed lunches or a cold plate for the evening. Tuesday, the stripped carcass went into a pot with an onion, a carrot, a bay leaf if there was one, and enough water to cover, and simmered for 2 hours until it had given up every remaining trace of flavor into the water, producing a stock that became the base for a soup or a stew that could feed the household again that evening, and potentially carry into Wednesday as well. From one purchase, at minimum 3 distinct meals, more often 4. The financial argument was not complicated. Buying chicken portions, which were becoming available in British butchers and the larger supermarkets through the 1970s, cost considerably more per pound of usable meat than buying the whole bird, because you were paying the butcher to do the work of breaking the bird down, and you were paying for packaging. And you were buying a product that came with no carcass attached, and therefore no stock, and therefore no additional meals. The whole bird required more from the person cooking it in terms of skill and planning and time. What it gave back was significantly greater than the sum of its visible parts. The skill involved in making this plan work had been passed down in the same way that most domestic financial skills transferred in British households of the period, through watching rather than being taught. A daughter who had grown up seeing her mother strip a carcass on a Monday evening and smell the stock simmering on a Tuesday morning had already absorbed the method before she had any reason to think of it as a method. It was simply how a chicken worked. The carcass produced the stock, because the carcass producing the stock was what you did with a carcass. Nobody had to explain it. The shift away from whole birds began in earnest in the late 1970s and accelerated sharply through the 1980s as supermarkets expanded their chilled sections and consumers, with more money available and less time at home, discovered that buying portions was faster and simpler. By 1990, nearly a quarter of all the meat eaten in Britain was chicken or turkey, and the format most of that came in was the breast fillet. Boneless, skinless, packaged, and carrying no carcass, and no stock potential, and no plan. The bird had been sold separately from everything it could have been. The saving was in the aisle, where it looked like convenience, and the cost was in the kitchen, where it looked like nothing at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. One bird stretched across a week because the plan was made before the first meal was cooked. The next trick also started before any money was spent, but it had nothing to do with food, and it ran on one of the oldest financial principles in Britain. Section 11. The mending basket. Somewhere in the sitting room, usually on a low table near the best chair or tucked beside the sofa within easy reach of the television, there was a basket. Not decorative, not ornamental, though it might have been a pleasant enough object in its own right, a wicker or fabric container with a close-fitting lid, kept shut against curious children and casual ransacking. Inside it lived the things a household wore that had not yet finished being worn: a shirt with a missing button, a pair of trousers with a fraying hem, 2 socks, not a matching pair, both with holes at the heel, a school jumper with a split at the elbow, a nightgown with a seam that had given way. None of these things were rubbish. They were waiting, and the basket was where they waited. And on a weekday evening, with the television on and something that required watching but not close attention, they got their turn. This was the mending basket, and in British households of the 1970s, its presence in the room was so unremarkable that it registered as furniture rather than practice. The basket had been there in one form or another for as long as anyone in the household could remember, because the habit it served was genuinely old, older than any living person in the house, old enough to have been formally codified in 18th century British domestic education. Young women in Georgian Britain learned to mend on darning samplers, needlework panels on which they demonstrated their mastery of repair techniques the same way they demonstrated embroidery, by doing it in front of an audience and keeping the evidence. The skills those samplers trained had not changed significantly by the time they appeared in a 1970s sitting room. The tools were the same in principle. The thread went over and under, the hole disappeared. The specific tool for the most common job, darning socks, was a small wooden form shaped roughly like a mushroom, with a rounded dome that fitted inside the sock and held the fabric taut across the damaged area while the needle worked. Without the mushroom, the sock was floppy, and the needle passed through at wrong angles, and the repair was lumpy and uncomfortable underfoot. With it, the surface was firm and level, and the crossing threads could be laid in regular parallel lines, horizontal, then vertical, until the weave was rebuilt and the hole was closed. Some households used a burned-out light bulb for the same purpose, its glass dome serving the mushroom's function at no cost beyond the bulb itself, which would have been thrown away regardless. The repair would then be turned inside out and worn again, and the heel of the sock would be thicker than the rest of it, and nobody considered this worth commenting on. The principle behind the basket was one of the oldest in British economic life. A thing with use remaining in it is not finished, and a finished thing is not a broken thing, but a thing that has given everything it had to give. Britain's Board of Trade gave this principle its most famous formal expression in 1942, when clothing rationing, imposed by the demands of wartime manufacturing shortages, prompted a government campaign called Make Do and Mend. The campaign distributed pamphlets, ran newsreel trailers, and created a character called Mrs. So-and-so to deliver its guidance through short films. But the campaign's content was not novel. It was simply a government endorsement of what British working-class households had been doing for generations before anyone thought to name it. Because the alternative to mending had always been purchasing, and purchasing cost money that the household might not have. By the 1970s, the Make, Do and Mend campaign was 30 years in the past. But its underlying logic had not left the households that had practiced it longest. The mending basket persisted because the economics still made sense, and in a decade when British inflation was running at rates that made every unnecessary purchase feel reckless, the sense was sharper than ever. A darning needle and a reel of wool cost pennies and lasted years. A new pair of socks cost money that was better directed elsewhere. The arithmetic was not complicated, and the skill required was modest enough that anyone who had been shown how to do it once could repeat it indefinitely. The habit declined as the material conditions that had sustained it changed in two specific ways. First, the growing prevalence of synthetic fabrics through the 1970s and 1980s created garments that resisted conventional mending. Nylon and polyester had different structures from wool and cotton, did not hold stitches in the same way, and frayed rather than wearing through in repairable holes. Second, the falling price of manufactured clothing relative to wages made the time cost of mending increasingly difficult to justify against the purchase cost of replacement. By the late 1970s, this calculation was already beginning to shift. And by the time fast fashion had established itself in the late 1990s, it had shifted decisively. A pair of socks that cost less than £1 did not have a mending case. Nothing that cheap ever would. The basket is still available. The mushroom is still sold. The skill still transfers in an afternoon to anyone who wants to learn it. And there is currently a documented revival of interest in visible mending in Britain and elsewhere, with sales of darning wool reportedly doubling year on year in some periods, as people rediscover what their grandmothers knew. The discovery is genuine. The knowledge was never lost. It was simply waiting, in a basket somewhere, for someone to pick it back up. Every garment in the basket still had life in it, and the basket was how you knew that and honored it. The next trick also extended the life of something that most households were throwing away too soon. But it had nothing to do with clothes, and everything to do with where your money was actually sitting. Section 12. Premium bonds. Once a month, usually in the first week, there was a particular kind of attention paid to an envelope. The envelope was unremarkable, plain government issue, arriving in the same letterbox as the electric bill and the postcard from a cousin in Blackpool. What made it notable was whether it arrived at all. Because if no envelope came from national savings in a given month, nothing had happened. An envelope meant something. Not necessarily much, but something. And the habit of checking for it was one of the gentlest of all financial rituals that passed through British households in the 1970s. A small, monthly permission to hope for something that cost you nothing extra, because the money was already safe and was not going anywhere. Premium bonds were introduced by Harold Macmillan as Chancellor of the Exchequer in his budget of April 1956 and went on sale to the public on the first day of November that year. By the end of that single day, the British public had purchased £5 million worth of them, a figure that reflected both genuine enthusiasm for a novel savings instrument and the particular quality of an idea that had been correctly timed. The principle was genuinely original. Instead of earning interest at a fixed rate, the money invested in premium bonds was pooled, and the interest that pool would have generated was distributed instead through a monthly lottery. Your capital was never at risk. You could always cash your bonds in and receive the original amount back in full. But rather than receiving interest, you received a chance, repeated every month, of receiving a prize. A pound bond entered every draw until it was redeemed. The longer you held it, the more draws it entered. The machine that ran the draw was called ERNIE, an acronym for Electronic Random Number Indicator Equipment, and its lineage gave premium bonds a particular British resonance that went beyond their financial function. ERNIE was designed by Tommy Flowers, who had also designed Colossus, the code-breaking computer built at Bletchley Park during the Second World War. Harry Fensham, another Bletchley veteran, was its chief engineer. The original machine generated random numbers using thermal noise from gas neon diodes, ran to the size of a van, and in its early years took as long as 10 days to complete a single monthly draw. When Ernie II arrived in 1973, it processed 65,000 bonds an hour and reduced the draw to 5.5 hours, still a significant undertaking by any contemporary standard. The name attached to this serious computational apparatus had the quality of a joke in the best British tradition. Warmly familiar, slightly absurd, entirely deliberate. The household logic behind premium bonds was clean and required almost no explanation once you understood it. Money sitting in a tin or a jar or a current account earned nothing. Putting that same money into premium bonds left it just as accessible, just as safe, backed in full by the Treasury, but doing something with every passing month rather than simply existing. For a household already practicing the jam jar system, the loose change jar, or the building society passbook, premium bonds occupied a complementary position. They were where you put money that had graduated past the jar but had not yet reached the passbook, or where you put windfalls, too irregular to plan around but too substantial to let sit idle. The particular atmosphere surrounding them in a 1970s household had a quality no other savings instrument quite replicated. Premium bonds sat somewhere between saving and gambling without being fully either, and that intermediate position gave them a social acceptability that a lottery ticket did not have. A lottery ticket cost money and was gone whether you won or lost. A premium bond cost nothing beyond the initial purchase and came back intact whenever you wanted it. The stake was never lost, only the interest was gambled. And interest was something that most working-class savers in the 1970s had very little of in any account, given that many households kept their spare money in ways that paid nothing at all. The competition premium bonds were replacing was not a high-interest savings account, but the kitchen tin. And against the kitchen tin, their case was unanswerable. The money was also tax-free, which gave it an additional advantage for anyone paying income tax at the higher rates that were not uncommon in the 1970s British tax structure, where the top rate reached 98% on investment income in 1974. At that level, tax-free prize winnings represented a form of return that could not be matched by any conventional interest-bearing account on an after-tax basis. A fact that made premium bonds attractive not just to working households managing small savings, but to people with significantly larger sums looking for a safe, government-backed, tax-efficient place to hold capital. The trick, and it was specifically a trick, was to buy them and hold them. The error that households made, and make still, was to cash them in too early, treating them as a short-term deposit rather than a permanent home for money that had no immediate purpose. Every bond that leaves the drawer takes with it every future chance it would have generated. A bond held for 30 years has entered 360 drawers. A bond cashed in after 6 months has entered 6. The prize pool has not changed. The odds have not changed. What changes with time is only the number of chances the money has had to do something. And that number grows without any additional effort or cost, as long as you leave the envelope unopened and the bond exactly where it is. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Your money was safe, your money was entered, and the only thing required of you was patience. The next trick also ran on patience, but a different kind. The patience of knowing exactly what things should cost before you agreed to pay anything at all. Section 13. The Witch Habit. The magazine had a specific weight in the hand, slightly denser than a general interest publication of similar size, and it was kept somewhere particular in every household that subscribed to it. Not on the coffee table, where you put things for visitors to pick up and browse. Somewhere more deliberate. On the shelf beside the household account book. In the drawer with the receipts, stacked with the previous issues in order of date. so the relevant one could be found quickly when a relevant purchase was being considered. The cover was plain and functional, no photography, no color beyond what the printing budget allowed, and the rating tables inside used a system of shaded blobs to indicate which product had tested best and which had tested worst, and where everything else fell between those 2 points. A page of blobs told you more than an hour in a shop, and the people who understood that were the people who subscribed. Which magazine was first published in October 1957, produced by the newly formed Consumers Association from a converted garage in Bethnal Green, East London. The founding editor was Earlis Roberts, and the founding purpose was direct and unapologetic: to test consumer products independently, without any financial relationship with the manufacturers being tested, and to publish the results in a form that ordinary people could use to make better purchasing decisions. The first issue ran to 32 pages and examined electric kettles, sunglasses, aspirin tablets, cake mixes, scouring powders, and 2 British cars, the Austin A35 and the Standard 10. Each product was tested against defined criteria. The results were expressed in comparable form, and a recommendation was made. The methodology was not complicated. What was novel was the independence and the rigor, and the deliberate absence of advertising revenue, which meant the magazine had no financial reason to favor any manufacturer over any other. The organization behind the magazine had been founded by Michael Young, a figure from the left of British politics who had grown frustrated with what he saw as a persistent indifference to consumer interests among those who claimed to represent working people. The Consumers Association grew faster than almost anyone had predicted, becoming by the late 1960s larger in membership than any of Britain's major political parties. By the time the 1970s arrived, the magazine had around 470,000 members and was, according to academic accounts of the period, both influential within official government consumer policy and genuinely indispensable to the households that took it seriously. 1 million members arrived by the late 1980s. At its peak, it was the largest voluntary association that had come into existence in Britain since the Second World War. The practical ritual it produced in a subscribing household had a specific shape. Before any significant purchase was made, a purchase above a certain threshold that the household had implicitly agreed to treat as requiring research, someone checked whether which had covered the relevant category. If it had, the relevant issue was retrieved, the test results were read, the recommended product and the near-recommended alternatives were noted, and the fair price range was established. Then the shopping happened, and the shopper went in already knowing what the product should cost, what its weaknesses were, what the salesperson's patter was likely to obscure, and what an acceptable deal looked like compared to an unreasonable one. The magazine had done the work in advance. The purchase itself was almost a formality. This preparation changed the dynamic of retail encounters in a way that was measurable in its effects, even if it was rarely made explicit. A salesperson selling a washing machine to someone who had read the relevant issue of Which was selling to someone who already knew which drum capacity was adequate for a family of 4, which brand had shown the worst reliability in post-purchase surveys, and approximately what the machine should cost if the retailer was pricing it fairly rather than ambitiously. That knowledge was not announced. It simply informed every question asked and every offer considered. And it prevented the specific kind of overpayment that comes from walking into a significant purchase with no prior knowledge of the territory. The 1970s issues of Which covered the concerns of the decade directly. Convenience meals were tested in March 1977. Solar water heating appeared in August 1977, presumably catching the tail of the long, hot summer of 1976, which had made alternative energy sources briefly feel like a realistic British proposition. Holidays in Spain featured in January 1972, as package tourism was becoming accessible to working households for the first time at scale. Decimalization appeared in November 1970, the year before the new currency arrived, as an attempt to help readers understand the new system before confusion could be exploited by retailers adjusting prices under cover of the conversion. The habit that which produced, the habit of researching before purchasing, rather than deciding at the point of sale, outlasted the magazine's monopoly on the information it supplied. What ended the specific role which had occupied was not the failure of the underlying idea, but its complete success. Once the internet made price and quality comparison instantaneous and free, the specific service of a monthly printed guide to tested products became a narrow offering within a much larger landscape of information. The Consumers Association still publishes and still tests, and the results are still independently reached and still worth reading. What is gone is the particular texture of the ritual. The dog-eared issue retrieved from the shelf, the blob table studied at the kitchen table, the careful note made on a piece of paper before anyone went anywhere near a shop. You walked in knowing what things should cost, and that knowledge alone changed everything about what you agreed to pay. The next trick required no research at all, no patience, no planning, and almost no conscious thought, and it saved money every single week for the households that practiced it. Section 14. The one-room rule. The cold was somewhere you walked into. You did not notice it as a condition because it was simply the texture of every part of the house that was not the living room. The hall was cold. The kitchen was cold, except when cooking was happening. The bathroom was cold in a way that required a particular kind of resolve first thing in the morning. The bedrooms were cold all day and cold when you got into them at night. And the getting in required a specific physical commitment. You lifted the covers, you slid in quickly, you pulled the weight of the blankets over yourself. And the cold from the sheets pressed against you and gradually became warmth. And by the time you were fully asleep, the bed was warm, and the room was still exactly as cold as it had been when you got in. And the breath you could see in the dark if you looked was evidence of neither poverty nor neglect. Heating only one room was not a strategy most British households of the early 1970s would have described as a strategy. It was simply what was available. In 1963, around 70% of British homes were still heated primarily by coal. The fire in the living room or the kitchen range, the central fact around which the household organized itself. Central heating existed, but it was expensive to install. It required infrastructure that most of the existing British housing stock had not been built to accommodate, and it was not yet something that ordinary families had any particular reason to consider normal or attainable. By 1977, a figure collected by the Building Research Establishment showed central heating had crossed 53% of all British homes for the first time. That figure tells you what was true of the other 47% and of the majority before it. What it produced in those homes without central heating was a household pattern that has since been described in terms of hardship, but was experienced at the time as ordinary life. The family gathered in the living room, because the living room was where the fire was, and the fire was where the warmth was. And warmth was not distributed abstractly through pipes and radiators, but sat in one place and required you to be near it. The coal fire or the gas fire in the grate was the anchor of the domestic evening. You sat near it. You went to it to get warm if you had been cold. You moved around it. Oral histories collected from working-class communities in South Yorkshire describe the coal fire as the epicenter of the home throughout the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, a role it had not fully surrendered by the early part of the following decade. The automatic money saving that came from this arrangement required no thought because it required no choice. You did not decide to heat only one room. You had one source of heat, and it was in one room, and that was where the warmth was. The bedrooms were not heated because there was no mechanism to heat them, and no expectation that they should be. A hot water bottle, filled from the kettle and slipped under the covers in advance of going to bed, was standard issue rather than a quaint supplement. It was the technology that made the transition from the warm room to the cold one bearable. Some households also had an electric bar heater that could be carried from room to room for specific purposes. A brief warming of the bathroom before a bath, or the edge taken off a bedroom before bed. But these were temporary and deliberate applications, rather than background heat, and they were switched off the moment the purpose was served. because leaving them on served no purpose and used electricity the household was paying for. The discipline this imposed on the use of energy was total and required no willpower to maintain, because willpower implies the possibility of doing otherwise. You could not run the central heating up because there was no central heating to run up. You could not heat a room you were not in because the only heat source was the room you were in. The structure of the house enforced the economy, and the economy was real. Household heating in the early 1970s represented a significant proportion of weekly expenditure, and the families that kept it, concentrated in one room, spent substantially less than they would have spent heating the whole house, even if they had had the means. The habit dissolved as central heating arrived, and its dissolution was not a moment of decision, but a gradual shift in the nature of the available choice. Once pipes and radiators connected every room to a boiler, the cold bedroom became optional rather than inevitable, and most households chose comfort over economy because the choice existed and had not existed before. The discipline that had been structural became voluntary, and voluntary discipline is harder to maintain than structural discipline because it requires constant renewal rather than simple acceptance. Energy companies have, since the sharp rise in fuel costs that began in the early 2020s, begun recommending to British households a practice they have given various names, but whose core content is identical to what those pre-central heating households had as a matter of course. Heat the room you are in. Turn down or turn off the heat in rooms not currently occupied. Shut doors to keep warmth where people are. The advice is offered as a modern energy-saving insight. For roughly half the country less than 50 years ago, it was simply how the house worked. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The warmth stayed where you were, and the rest of the house stayed cold, and the weekly bill stayed lower than it would have been any other way. The next trick also made use of something everyone had, but almost nobody thought to treat as a financial tool. Section 15. The allotment. On a Saturday morning in summer, a particular kind of person was somewhere that was not a shop. They were standing on a rectangle of earth roughly the size of a tennis court, and they were pulling something out of the ground, or cutting something from a vine, or carrying something to a shed that smelled of creosote and old sacking, and the specific dry warmth of a space that gets sun through one small window. The plot had a number painted on a post at the gate. The neighbouring plots had their own numbers and their own particular arrangements of beds and canes and netting and a shed of slightly different character. At the far end of the site, someone was burning something that did not need to be burned yet, just because burning things on a quiet Saturday morning at an allotment was one of the pleasures available. Nobody here was thinking about money. That was part of what made it work. The British allotment system was old enough by the 1970s to have its own legal architecture, its own parliamentary history, and its own social customs that newcomers absorbed without being explicitly taught. The Small Holdings and Allotments Act of 1908 had placed a formal duty on local authorities to provide allotment land where demand existed, and the Allotments Act of 1925 had strengthened that protection by requiring ministerial consent before any statutory allotment site could be sold or converted to another use. These were not theoretical entitlements. They were operative law, and their practical effect was that in almost every British town of any size, somewhere within walking or cycling distance, there was a site of rectangular plots available for rent at annual charges that were deliberately kept low enough that the purpose of the legislation, access to growing land for those who had no garden of their own, was not defeated by the cost of taking it up. At the beginning of the 1970s, around 500,000 allotment plots were active in Britain, a figure that represented a steep decline from the wartime peak of approximately 1,750,000 during the Dig for Victory campaign of the Second World War, when every available piece of ground, from Hyde Park to the Tower of London Moat, had been pressed into vegetable production. By the mid-1970s, the number had stopped declining and was in fact rising, as a mood of self-sufficiency and growing interest in food provenance found expression in a television series that began in January 1975 and ran for 4 series. The Good Life, starring Richard Briers and Felicity Kendall, as a couple who abandoned their suburban professional lives to become entirely self-sufficient in their Surbiton garden, was a comedy rather than an instruction manual. But its success reflected something genuine in the cultural atmosphere of the decade. A growing conviction that dependence on industrial food systems carried costs that were not fully visible in the price on the shelf. What the allotment produced for a household that used it consistently was not a single dramatic saving, but a sustained and seasonal reduction in the fresh vegetable bill that accumulated across the growing year in a way that was difficult to quantify because it was never experienced as a transaction. You did not buy runner beans in August. You picked them and brought them home in a bag, and they were better than the ones in the shop, and they cost nothing beyond the annual rent of the plot and the effort of growing them. That rent, even allowing for regional variation, was in the 1970s a figure small enough to be covered several times over by a single decent harvest. Some plots charged as little as a few pounds a year. The vegetables that came from them across a full growing season, potatoes, leeks, cabbages, runner beans, onions, soft fruit in season, could represent a meaningful fraction of a household's annual fresh produce expenditure. The allotment community that surrounded this was its own kind of resource, one that operated on a logic of informal reciprocity rather than formal exchange. A plot holder who had too many courgettes passed them over the path to the neighbor. Seeds were divided and shared. Cuttings were pressed on people who had expressed an interest in growing something new. The person who had been on the site for 30 years and whose beds were immaculate and whose shed contained tools you had never seen before was a source of practical knowledge freely given to anyone willing to listen. Because knowing things about growing and being known to know things about growing was part of what the allotment gave back in return for the time you put in. The decline came in stages, driven by several forces arriving at different speeds. Supermarket produce became progressively cheaper through the 1980s and 1990s as industrial food systems achieved efficiencies of scale that made the growing season irrelevant, and the price of a bag of potatoes low enough that the argument for growing your own shifted from economic to something more philosophical. Councils began selling off allotment land for housing development at a rate that reduced the available stock from around 500,000 plots in the early 1970s to around 297,000 by 1996. The waiting lists that now stretch to a decade in some London boroughs are the legacy of that loss. The demand that the 1908 Act was designed to meet is still there, and the land to meet it increasingly is not. The vegetables came up every year on that rectangle of earth, and the bill for them never appeared anywhere because there was no bill. The next trick was quieter still, built not into a patch of ground, but into a single habit of mind about what money actually was and what it was actually for. Section 16. The debt-free principle. There was a word for it that carried its own quiet satisfaction. Clear. To be clear meant to owe nothing to anyone. No outstanding hire purchase agreement, no tally at the corner shop running past the end of the week, no loan from a family member, no bill left to settle. It was not a word that described a balance sheet. It described a character. And in British working-class households of the 1970s, it was used with the specific pride of someone who had managed something worth managing. The opposite of clear was not poor. You could be poor and clear simultaneously. The opposite of clear was in debt, and in debt was something a careful household organized its entire financial life around avoiding. This was the habit of mind that underpinned everything else. A specific, working understanding of what money actually was and what it was not. Money was the amount you currently held or were owed from work already done. It was not what you might have access to, not what a lender was willing to advance you, not what you could put on a piece of plastic and settle later. The distinction between those two things was a moral one as much as a practical one, and it shaped every financial decision a household made before the decision was consciously examined at all. When the question was whether to buy something, the real question was always the same. Did you have the money, meaning the actual money, right now, in the jar or the passbook or the pay packet? If the answer was no, the conversation was over. Britain's first credit card had been introduced by Barclays on the 29th of June 1966, initially available only to selected account holders and carrying a maximum credit limit of just £50, or £100 for established borrowers. In its first year, more than 1 million cards were issued, though a significant proportion of recipients returned them unused, unsure what they were for, or unwilling to begin a relationship with something that functioned on the logic of spending money not yet earned. Barclaycard would not record its first operating profit until 1972, 6 years after launch, by which time it had 1.7 million cardholders and around 52,000 merchant outlets willing to accept it. The Access card arrived in the same year to compete. The hire purchase debt outstanding across Britain by March 1972 had reached £1,678 million, a figure cited in parliamentary debate on the Crowther Committee's report as evidence of how thoroughly credit had become embedded in the national economy. All of this expansion was happening alongside and in direct tension with a set of values that the people it was expanding into had inherited from their parents and grandparents, and in some cases from several generations before that. Victorian moral culture had made thrift and the avoidance of debt not merely prudent practices, but virtues in the character sense, evidence of self-command, of reliability, of the quality that made a person trustworthy. Working-class communities had specific and long-established formal arrangements for providing credit to their members, from the corner shop tabs settled weekly from the pay packet to the check traders and tallymen who visited households door to door. But these were short-term arrangements, always intended to smooth the interval between need and payment, rather than to fund consumption that lay permanently beyond current means. The principle they operated on was the same one the credit card violated. You borrowed against money coming, not against money you might one day have. The Crowther Committee, which published its landmark report on consumer credit in March 1971, and whose recommendations eventually produced the Consumer Credit Act of 1974, observed directly in its findings that the less educated and poorer members of the community were frequently paying higher interest rates than their credit risk actually warranted, precisely because they lacked the knowledge of the credit market that would have allowed them to compare terms and locate better offers. The committee was identifying a problem that the debt-free principle had been a practical solution to for generations before anyone had a name for the problem. If you did not borrow, the interest rate was irrelevant, and no lender could profit from your ignorance of what you were being charged. The social architecture of the principle was enforced by community as much as by individual conscience. In a street where most families knew most other families' general financial situation without having direct access to the details, the visible signs of living beyond your means carried a social cost. New furniture purchased on hire purchase, when the household's income did not obviously support it, was noticed. A pattern of borrowing from neighbors or family was noticed. Being clear was noticed too, though more quietly. A household that had weathered a difficult year without acquiring new obligations had done something that carried its own standing among people who understood what that meant. The principle eroded gradually through the 1970s and rapidly through the 1980s, as credit card ownership became normal. Hire purchase was replaced by personal loans with more favorable terms, and the financial deregulation of 1986 removed the remaining structural limits on what lenders could offer and to whom. By the 1990s, debt had been culturally reclassified from a condition to be avoided to a tool to be managed, and the language reflected the shift. Nobody spoke of being clear anymore, in the sense the word had carried. The goal became not clearing debt, but servicing it, which is a different project entirely, and one that never quite ends. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. To be clear was the goal, and clear meant nothing owed to anyone and nothing coming due. The next trick was smaller and more specific, and ran on similar logic, applied not to your whole financial life, but to a single object that most British households had in a drawer and never fully thought about. Section 17. The divvy number. Before you left the house to do the shopping, you were given a number. Not written down, not tucked into the shopping bag alongside the list, but spoken to you by whoever was sending you, and repeated back by you before the door closed. Because the number was the kind of thing you were expected to carry in your head rather than in your pocket. It was not a long number. 4 digits for many households, 5 for some. Easy enough for a child of 7 or 8 to memorize from the 3rd or 4th repetition, which was the point. A child running an errand to the corner shop was expected to give the number at the counter, every time, without prompting or hesitation. The number was the membership number of the cooperative society, and it needed to be quoted with every purchase. And the reason it needed to be quoted was that every purchase was being recorded against it. What the number unlocked was the dividend, known to every household that had one simply as the divvy, a word that carried a specific weight of practical affection that most financial products never achieve. The principle behind it was one of the founding ideas of the British cooperative movement, traced directly to the Rochdale Society of Equitable Pioneers, the workers' cooperative established in Rochdale in 1844, that is generally considered the origin point of the modern cooperative structure. Rather than distributing profits to shareholders, the cooperative distributed them to members in proportion to what each member had spent. The more you bought at the co-op, the larger your dividend. The dividend belonged to you by right of membership and by right of the purchases you had already made. Getting it was not luck or competition, it was arithmetic. Dividend day arrived quarterly or twice yearly, depending on which cooperative society your household belonged to, and it was anticipated with a kind of keyed-up seriousness that a modern quarterly bank statement does not inspire. Former co-op employees describing the period recall queues extending the length of the street outside the payment office, members clutching their membership books and their calculation of what they were owed, the accumulated purchases of 6 months finally converting into something tangible and cashable. For many working-class families in the North and Midlands and across Scotland, where the cooperative movement had its deepest roots, the dividend was the predictable annual cash event around which certain purchases were planned. Phyllis Taylor from Wallascourt in the West Midlands recalled that dividend day for her family meant a new pair of shoes. Not a luxury, a necessity, timed to the dividend because that was when the money for it was reliably available. The divvy number achieved a kind of household permanence that few other pieces of financial information managed. It was written on the wall by the back door in some homes, permanently available to anyone coming or going. Some people remembered not just their own family's number, but the numbers of neighbours and friends' families, because children who ran errands together needed to quote the right number at the right counter, and the numbers overlapped in memory by repetition and association. Online forums from the early 2000s contained dozens of contributions from people who had entirely forgotten their national insurance numbers, their PIN numbers, their own childhood telephone numbers, but who still knew their mother's divvy number with perfect accuracy, and who acknowledged this without any apparent surprise, as though it were the most natural thing in the world that a number learned in a 1960s kitchen would outlast everything else. In 1949, the cooperative movement introduced national membership, allowing members to shop at any cooperative society store anywhere in the country and accumulate dividend credit, regardless of which local society they belonged to. The advertising for this innovation carried the line that "she shall have divvy wherever she goes," a reference to a nursery rhyme that positioned the dividend as a domestic right, as basic and reliable as shelter. By this point, there were millions of co-op members across Britain, and the movement's retail operations were a central part of working-class household provisioning in a way that has no direct equivalent today. The trick was not having the number. Almost every household in the communities where the co-op operated had the number. The trick was using it consistently, then collecting. The object in the drawer was the membership share book, a small document that recorded the members' accumulated share capital and their entitlement to the dividend that was accruing against it. Many households had this book and rarely looked at it. They shopped at the co-op and they gave the number, but the connection between those regular small acts and the cash event twice a year that those acts were accumulating toward was one that required attention to maintain. A household that shopped at the co-op without giving the number, or gave the number without collecting the dividend, had done most of the work for none of the return. The traditional dividend was phased out by most cooperative societies in the late 1960s, replaced first by co-op stamps and later by the modern loyalty card structure that the contemporary co-op operates. The stamps and cards ran on the same underlying principle, but removed the specific community theatre of dividend day, the queue, the membership book, the 4-digit number spoken from memory at a wooden counter. What replaced it was more convenient and slightly less real, in the way that a loyalty point has always been slightly less real than a payment made in cash to a person you recognize in a building you could walk to. The number was how the money found its way back to you, and every household that knew it and used it collected something that otherwise stayed on the books unclaimed. The next trick was about knowing when not to spend, which sounds simple, but required a specific kind of discipline that most households have now entirely lost the habit of. Section 18. The closed Sunday. By 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning, the street was already telling you what the day was going to be. The grocer was shut. The hardware shop was shut. The newsagent had closed at 8:30 after the papers went, and the butcher was shut with a certainty that felt not like a commercial decision, but like a physical law. Anywhere you might have spent money was either dark behind its shutters or simply not open to the idea of you today. The day had a specific quality of stillness that was not emptiness but finitude. You had what you had until the morning, and what you had was going to remain what you had until then. Because nowhere was available to receive any of it. Britain's Shops Act of 1950 prohibited most retail premises in England and Wales from serving customers on Sundays, carrying forward a legal framework for Sunday closure that predated it by generations and had its deepest roots in the early legislation of King Charles I. The practical consequence in the 1970s was that a significant portion of the country's retail infrastructure was legally inoperative one day in 7. And that inoperability was not partial or theoretical. Department stores were closed, supermarkets were closed, clothing shops, furniture shops, hardware shops, shoe shops, electrical retailers, toy shops, all closed, with the exception of certain exempted categories that produced anomalies so extraordinary that the courts regularly found themselves unable to interpret them coherently. You could buy fresh fruit and vegetables, but not if they were tinned. You could buy razor blades for medicinal purposes, which the law defined as removing corns, but not for shaving. You could purchase fish and chips from a sit-down restaurant, but not from a chip shop. The law was, as one judge observed in a case brought under it, one in which almost no nonsensical proposition could be dismissed as impossible. None of this mattered to the household budget in the way that mattered. What mattered was simpler. The money did not go anywhere. The money that was in the jam jar, or the purse, or the coat pocket on Saturday night was still in the jam jar, or the purse, or the coat pocket on Sunday evening. Not because of willpower, not because of planning, not because of any financial discipline the household had cultivated or maintained. Simply because the mechanism by which money left households was unavailable for the day. The shops were shut. There was nowhere for it to go. The psychological effect of an automatic no-spend day was one that nobody who lived within it would have thought to describe as financial management, because it required no management. It was simply Sunday. You did not think about not spending money on a Sunday, because the question of spending money on a Sunday did not arise. The question that did not arise could not produce the particular internal weather that follows the question that does arise and is answered in the wrong direction. The purchase you had not planned, the thing you saw and decided to get, the small and individually reasonable expenditure that accumulates into a weekly total you do not want to examine too closely. Sunday was structurally exempt from all of that. The household that used Sunday as the occasion for the week's financial accounting was working with this structure deliberately. The household account book was opened. The week's expenditures were totaled. The figures were compared with the plan. The week's purchases were reviewed with the specific emotional distance that comes from reviewing decisions that are now entirely finished. Nothing from this week's spending list could be added to or subtracted from by anything that happened today. The numbers were what they were. The following week's plan could be adjusted accordingly. The day was, in this sense, a natural audit point built into every calendar at no cost and with no possibility of avoidance. The law was not uniformly beloved. The anomalies surrounding what could and could not be sold on Sundays generated genuine frustration, and efforts to reform Sunday trading began in earnest in the early 1980s. A Sunday trading bill, introduced in 1986, became, unusually, the only government bill defeated during the entirety of Margaret Thatcher's time as Prime Minister, with 72 Conservative members of Parliament voting against it in a rebellion large enough to sink a measure its own government had sponsored. The Keep Sunday Special campaign that organised opposition to deregulation was religiously motivated in part, but drew support from people whose concern was primarily the working conditions of retail employees, who would lose the premium pay that Sunday working had always commanded. When the law finally changed with the Sunday Trading Act of 1994, the change was presented primarily as consumer choice, the freedom to shop on any day you chose. The framing was entirely about what people gained. Almost nothing was said about what people were giving up. What was given up was not a legal restriction, but a weekly rhythm. One day in 7, during which the question of spending simply did not arise. During which the money stayed put of its own structural accord. During which the household's resources were neither increased nor diminished by retail contact of any kind. Once the shops opened on Sundays, spending on Sundays became possible. And once it became possible, it became normal. And once it became normal, it became expected. The willpower required to not spend on a Sunday, now that spending on a Sunday is an option freely available, is a different and more demanding kind of willpower than simply being confronted by a row of shut shop fronts and accepting that today is not that day. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The money stayed put because there was nowhere to put it. And that structural certainty was its own kind of financial discipline, requiring nothing from you. The next trick also required almost nothing, but it produced something specific that most households today have no equivalent of and would struggle to name if asked. Section 19. The store cupboard reserve. When you put a tin of something away in the cupboard, you put the new tin behind the old one. The old tin came to the front, where it would be used first. The new tin sat behind it, waiting to become the old tin when its turn arrived. This was not a complex system. It took perhaps 3 extra seconds of movement each time you unpacked the shopping. But done consistently, over weeks and months, it produced something that had a specific value most households today genuinely lack and would struggle to articulate if you asked them to name what was missing. What it produced was a week's worth of food that you were not about to eat. The store cupboard reserve was a standard feature of the British working-class kitchen throughout the first half of the 20th century, and had not disappeared by the 1970s, though its character had changed with the arrival of tinned food on a broad scale. Earlier generations had kept dried goods, flour, oats, pulses, sugar, salt, the kinds of provisions that stored well and could sustain a household through a disruption in supply or income. By the 1970s, the reserve had been augmented by tinned goods, corned beef, sardines, baked beans, tinned tomatoes, tinned fruit, condensed milk, soup. These had longer shelf lives than their fresh equivalents, cost less than fresh equivalents when bought in quantity during a shop, and could be rotated in the put-new-behind-old fashion without waste or spoilage. A kitchen cupboard managed this way held, at any given moment, somewhere between 5 and 10 days' worth of basic eating that had already been paid for, that did not require refrigeration, and that was not part of this week's meal plan. The financial logic of this reserve was not about the cost of the tins. It was about what the tins represented, a buffer between the household and a category of emergency that would otherwise require money the household did not have ready. In the 1970s, that category of emergency had a specific British texture. The decade saw a sugar shortage in 1973 and shortages of bread and other basics in the winters of 1974 and 1977, as industrial disputes and supply disruptions rippled through the food chain. Supermarkets introduced rationing of sugar and bread during these periods. Families that already had sugar in a cupboard were not in the queue. Families that had bread in a freezer, or flour to make it, were not dependent on a shop that might have none. The reserve absorbed the crisis, and the crisis was a specifically 1970s kind. Not personal catastrophe, but collective disruption arriving without much warning and lasting longer than expected. The British government had been explicit about the principle of the household reserve at various points during the Cold War, most directly in the Protect and Survive public information materials that circulated from 1974, which recommended that households stock enough food to last 14 days in the event of nuclear attack. The recommendation was extreme in its scenario, but the underlying logic was not extreme at all. Until 1995, the government itself maintained approximately 200,000 tons of food in secure buffer depots around the country, the last remnant of wartime food planning. The final clearance of these depots happened quietly, without announcement, as just-in-time supply chains made the concept of physical reserves seem obsolete. The depots closed because their function had been transferred, invisibly, to the supermarket distribution network and its capacity to restock within hours. The logic of the household store cupboard followed the same fate. What replaced the reserve was the convenience of perpetual availability. If the cupboard was empty on a Wednesday, the supermarket was open on Wednesday. If you ran out of tinned tomatoes on a Sunday morning, there was usually somewhere open by 10. The practical reason for maintaining a reserve against the week ahead eroded in exact proportion to the expansion of shopping hours and the sophistication of just-in-time logistics. By the 2000s, most British supermarkets were restocking overnight and had made the idea of running out of anything, at most times, effectively theoretical. The household reserve began to feel like hoarding, eccentric, slightly anxious, a habit for people who worried too much. What the reserve had produced, beyond the week's worth of food, was a specific texture of financial confidence that came from knowing the household had margin. Not much margin, not the kind that goes into the investment portfolio. Simply the knowledge that if this week's wages were delayed, or the shopping could not happen, or something broke and the household's cash was absorbed into repair, the family could eat for another 7 days without anyone noticing the difference. That margin was not savings. It was not insurance. It had no formal financial name because it was a physical buffer rather than a monetary one. Tins on a shelf that converted into meals in an emergency without anyone having to visit a bank or make a decision. The pandemic of 2020 revealed how thoroughly the habit had been lost. The first days of lockdown produced photographs of empty supermarket shelves that surprised and frightened people who had not, in living memory, experienced a week when the shelves were not reliably full. The items that vanished first were exactly the store cupboard items the 1970s household would have already had. Pasta, tinned tomatoes, flour, tinned fish. The panic was real. And the reason it was real was that most households had less than 4 days' worth of food in their kitchens when the disruption arrived. The tins at the back of the cupboard were margin, and margin was what made a difficult week survivable without crisis. The next trick was the last of the ones you could see, the final visible habit before we arrive at the one nobody ever talked about, but nearly everyone understood. Section 20. The library card. Saturday morning had a particular sequence in the households that used it well. And one step in that sequence happened at a building most people walked past without going in. You took back what you had finished with. You chose what you were going to read next. You did this at a counter staffed by someone who stamped a date label inside the back cover of each book. And the date label told you when the book was due back. and the book was due back in 3 weeks. And the book had cost you nothing. The library card lived in a wallet or a kitchen drawer, a small cardboard rectangle with a membership number on it. And it was one of the most quietly powerful financial instruments in the possession of any British household that understood how to use it. Britain's public library system was founded in law with the Public Libraries Act of 1850, which empowered local councils to levy a rate to fund free public libraries. By 1914, 62% of England's population lived within a library authority area. By 1950, the figure cited by a contemporary newspaper was 23,000 libraries serving 12 million readers who borrowed 300 million books a year, which the Edinburgh Evening News in that year described without apparent exaggeration as the best public library system in the world. By the 1970s, the system was mature enough that virtually every town of any size had at least one branch. That branch had a lending section for adults and a separate section for children, and the library card that gave access to both was free to any resident who applied for one. The financial calculation available to a household that used the library with genuine consistency was not trivial. A reader who borrowed 2 books per week across 50 weeks of the year had read 100 books at no cost beyond occasional small fines for late returns. The same reading habit, supported by purchase rather than borrowing, even at paperback prices, would have represented several £100s across a year. For working-class households in the 1970s, where several £100s was a sum that bore directly on the rent and the food bill and the children's clothing, the difference between borrowing and buying was not aesthetic, it was material. Children's books were a specific and significant part of this calculation. A child who was reading through the library's stock was a child who was not generating a continuous demand for new books. And in households with more than one child, the library substituted for what would otherwise have been a substantial recurring expenditure. Children's librarians in the 1970s were a distinct and serious professional category, whose role included not just managing stock, but actively guiding young readers toward what would challenge and reward them. The library's children's section, with its low shelves and small chairs and the particular smell of many handled books in a quiet room, was an institution that many British adults recall with a specificity of detail that suggests they spent enough time there for it to become genuinely familiar. Many public libraries in the 1970s also lent records. The LP section sat usually behind the main book lending desk, its sleeves filed in browser racks that you flip through the way you might flip through a catalogue. You could borrow an album for the same period and on the same terms as a book. Take it home, play it however many times you chose, return it when due. For a household that could not afford to buy records, this was access to music that would otherwise not have been affordable. The library copy was often worn, its surface mildly scratched from previous borrowings, but it played, and the playing was free. The library also served as a reference resource that, for the households that used it correctly, eliminated an entire category of minor expenditure. Reference books, encyclopedias, street directories, trade manuals, legal guides, medical reference volumes. All of these were things you might otherwise purchase at some point and use occasionally, and all of them were available in the library's reference section for free consultation on the premises. A household that needed to know something specific used the library to find out, at the cost of a short journey and a short wait, rather than purchasing a book that would answer the question once and then occupy shelf space. The library was, in functional terms, the household's external reference department. The habit of regular library use produced something that no modern equivalent quite replicates. The person who had borrowed and read 100 books in a year had been educated, entertained, informed, and challenged at a cost effectively equal to zero. The same person using a streaming subscription, a podcast platform, and a digital book service has achieved something of comparable scope, but at a monthly cost that accumulates across a year to a figure a 1970s household would have recognized as real money. The library was free, genuinely and unconditionally free. without the asterisk of a subscription that continues to renew unless actively cancelled. The library service in Britain declined significantly from the late 1980s onward as local authority funding cuts reduced hours, closed branches, and diminished stock. By 2012, library use had fallen to levels that prompted formal government attention, and the number of physical libraries had contracted substantially from the 1970s peak. What the system had provided, in its fullest form, was a complete alternative to a significant proportion of what households now pay for in monthly subscription fees. The library card was a pass to all of it, and it was free, and it lived in a drawer. And most households in the country had one and used it every week, and never thought of it as a financial tool at all, which is perhaps the most accurate measure of how thoroughly it was simply a part of life. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The library gave you everything it had and asked only that you bring it back. The next trick had no building, no card, no physical object of any kind. It lived entirely in the mind, passed from person to person without ever being written down. And it may have been the most powerful of all 23. Section 21. The sufficiency threshold. There was no name for it, and no occasion on which it was ever formally decided. It was not a budget in the sense of a plan written down and followed. It was something closer to an orientation, a settled understanding, shared across the household without being discussed, of what the household actually needed in order to be all right. Not comfortable in any luxurious sense, not aspirational, simply all right. The standard was internal, and it was stable. And once a household had it, everything else followed from it, as naturally as water finding its level. You knew what you were trying to achieve. When you had it, you stopped. You did not keep reaching beyond it because there was nothing beyond it worth specifically reaching for, and no one nearby whose possession of more made you feel the lack of what you did not have. This was the unspoken financial habit that underpinned everything else in this list, and it is the one that has been most completely dismantled by the decades since. It had no building and no card and no physical object of any kind. It could not be represented on a shelf or in a drawer. It lived entirely in the mind of the household, reinforced by the community around it. And it was passed from one generation to the next, not by instruction, but by the simple fact of watching adults who had it behave according to it, year after year, without ever naming what they were doing. The threshold was not the same in every household. A family in Sunderland and a family in Bristol might have had different ideas of what enough looked like in specific terms, because the cost of the same life varied by place and the expectations of each community shaped the definition. But the structure of the threshold was the same. It existed, it was known, and it created a natural stopping point in the continuous process of wanting and acquiring that consumer culture was beginning, in the 1970s, to make into a permanent condition of British life. When you reached the threshold, you were not dissatisfied, you were done. You directed whatever was left over after the threshold was met into the jam jar, the building society passbook, the premium bonds, the store cupboard. You did not direct it into the next thing you wanted, because the next thing you wanted was not part of the threshold, and the threshold was what defined what you actually needed from what you merely might enjoy having. The structural conditions that supported this habit in the 1970s were specific and have since been systematically removed. Television, which had 3 channels and closed down before midnight, carried advertising, but not at the density or sophistication of later decades. And the advertising it carried was for products within a fairly narrow range of what working-class households were likely to purchase anyway. The social environment of a working-class community, where most of what your neighbors had was visible and known without anyone saying so, created a shared reference point for what enough looked like in practice. If everyone on the street had roughly similar furniture, clothing, and domestic equipment, the definition of enough was anchored to something real and local, rather than to an idealized image constructed by advertising and disseminated through media specifically designed to make you feel the lack of what you did not have. The advertising industry understood the sufficiency threshold as an obstacle to growth and worked systematically across the 1970s and 1980s to dissolve it. The shift from need-based advertising, which told you that a product was useful and cost a certain amount, to aspiration-based advertising, which told you that a product was what people like you aspired to and that your current life was the less for not containing it, was one of the most significant financial interventions in British domestic life of the 20th century. It did not change anything material. It changed the relationship between a household and its own definition of enough. Once the threshold was not a stable internal point, but a moving external one that advertising kept placing just beyond your current position, the threshold ceased to function as a financial discipline and became instead a permanent dissatisfaction. The credit card completed the attack on the threshold that aspiration-based advertising had begun. The sufficiency threshold was protected by the jam jar system and the debt-free principle precisely because, when you spent what you had and it was gone, the threshold was enforced by reality. Running out of money in a jam jar is not a crisis if you have reached the threshold. It is simply the week finished. Running out of available credit on a card is an entirely different event, one that can be deferred by increasing the credit limit, which the card company will happily arrange, and then deferred again. The threshold cannot survive in a system that has no practical lower boundary on what you can spend, because the threshold was always ultimately enforced by the concrete reality of the money finishing. The habit was transmitted by example and maintained by community. Both of those transmission mechanisms have weakened. The communities that sustained a shared definition of enough have dispersed and fragmented. The examples available to imitation are now global rather than local. And globally, the aspiration curve is set by people whose threshold, if they have one, is orders of magnitude higher than anything working-class Britain in the 1970s would have recognized as relevant to its own situation. The threshold still works for any household that can locate it and hold it. The difficulty is that nothing in the current environment assists in the locating, and everything in it works against the holding. The threshold was the thing that all the other habits were serving, and when the threshold held, everything held with it. There are two more of these to name, and the next one is the most practical of all, the one that requires nothing except a calendar and the willingness to write something down once a year. Section 22. The annual tax check. Late May or early June, a brown envelope arrived from the Inland Revenue. It was not thick. It contained a single document, usually a printed form with columns of figures, and it told you what you had earned in the tax year just finished and how much tax had been taken from that earning by your employer, week by week, throughout the preceding 12 months. The document was the P60, and every employee in the country received one by the end of May each year. Most people filed it in a drawer or a folder without looking at it closely, and the money they should have received back but did not know to claim stayed where it was. The habit this section is about required one act once a year and a calendar note written in January to remind you of it. When the P60 arrived, you read it. You checked the figure for tax paid against the figure for earnings. You checked the tax code on the form against the tax code you had been allocated at the start of the year and had either been given reason to question or had no particular reason to trust. If the code was wrong, you wrote a letter to the local tax office and said so. If you had unreimbursed expenses from work that the code was not accounting for, you wrote a letter to the local tax office and said that too. The letter went off. After some weeks, a correction arrived, and with it, in many cases, a refund of the tax that had been taken from your pay in error throughout the previous year. The PAYE system, which had been established in 1944 as a mechanism for collecting income tax directly from wages before they reached the worker, had by the mid-1970s grown into what the Inland Revenue's own board described in 1978 as a paper chase of gigantic proportions. tax records for individual workers were maintained manually on cards. The system was split across regional offices that shared information by post. Workers who had more than one employer, or who changed jobs during the year, or who had additional income from any source, were particularly likely to end up with codes that bore an imperfect relationship to their actual circumstances. The basic rate of income tax in 1975 stood at 35%, rising to 38% by 1977, which meant that an error in the tax code of even modest size translated into a meaningful sum withdrawn from the household's pay every week throughout the year. The categories of expense that workers in skilled trades and professions could claim against their tax, but which were not automatically accounted for, were numerous and widely unknown. Tools purchased by workers for their own use, not supplied by the employer. The cost of maintaining a uniform or protective clothing. Professional subscription fees paid to a trade association or union. The cost of keeping a vehicle in a state of roadworthiness, where that vehicle was used partly for work. In each case, the relevant amount could be claimed as a deduction from taxable income, which meant the tax on it was not owed, and, if it had been paid through a code that did not account for it, was reclaimable. Many workers in exactly these trades paid these costs, submitted nothing, and received nothing back, because the mechanism for recovery required knowing the mechanism existed and then using it. The calendar note was the tool that made the habit function. Written in January, when the new tax year was approaching and the mind turned briefly toward financial housekeeping, P60 due by end of May, check code, check expenses, write if needed. The note cost nothing. If it was acted on, and if the code turned out to be wrong, or if there were expenses unclaimed, the return from that single annual letter could cover several weeks of food shopping. If the code was right and the expenses were already accounted for, nothing happened, and nothing was lost beyond a few minutes of reading and a stamp. The asymmetry of that bet, minimal cost against significant potential upside, made it one of the most efficient financial habits available to any working household, which is possibly why its absence is now estimated by tax specialists to cost British workers billions of pounds in unclaimed refunds every year. The PAYE system was partly computerized in 1984, which reduced some categories of error but introduced new ones, as databases that had no automatic data feed between them struggled to account for workers with multiple income sources. The principle that HMRC has no legal obligation to inform individuals of overpayments or refunds due has not changed. The money waits. It waits for as long as 4 years, which is the window within which a claim can be submitted. After 4 years, it does not come back. The household that knew this checked. The household that did not know this sent its money to the Treasury and left it there. Checking your tax code today requires a government gateway account and a few minutes on the HMRC website. The basic rate of income tax is 20%, lower than the 1970s, which means the cost of an error is proportionally smaller, though the principle is identical. The difference between then and now is that in the 1970s, the error rate in the manual system was high enough that checking was very likely to find something, while today the automated systems produce fewer errors and the marginal value of the check is lower. But it is not zero. And the calendar note, the one annual act of writing a date down in January and then acting on what arrives in May, is still available to anyone. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That was 22. The last one does not belong to any single household. It belongs to all of them at once. And it was built not out of any particular habit, but out of the accumulated understanding of what every habit here was actually for. Section 23. What all of it was for. 22 habits, 22 separate practices, and beneath every one of them, the same thing. Not thrift exactly, though that is the word most often reached for when describing households that kept dripping basins and mending baskets and divvy numbers stored in memory. Not poverty, though though some of these habits were born in conditions of genuine scarcity and carried their emergency logic into less acute times. What they share, what the jar and the passbook and the account book and the P60 and the library card and the allotment plot all have in common, is something quieter and more fundamental: attention. Every single one of these practices was a mechanism for paying attention to money that would otherwise have moved through the household without being noticed or directed or claimed. The jar made the money visible. The passbook made the accumulation visible. The account book made the outflow visible. The P60 made the overpayment visible. The divvy number made the dividend visible. The market stall at 4 o'clock made the discount visible. The mending basket made the alternative to replacement visible. None of these tools did anything except make something visible that would otherwise have remained invisible. And the visibility was the entire point. Once you could see where the money was, you could decide where it went. Once you could see what was accumulating, you could direct what was left. Once you could see the error in the tax code, you could correct it. The financial power of these habits was not in any complexity of mechanism or sophistication of strategy. It was in the simple, unglamorous, entirely repeatable act of looking. What is most striking about this list, when you sit with all 22 of them at once, is how little any of them required. The jam jars were in the kitchen already. The Building Society branch was on the high street. The P60 arrived in the post. The library was free and half a mile away. The allotment cost a few pounds a year. The mending basket needed a needle and thread. The store cupboard was the kitchen cupboard used differently. The only resource most of these habits consumed, beyond the trivial costs of their objects and their membership, was time, and not much of that. 20 minutes once a week at the Building Society. 1 letter once a year to the Inland Revenue. 10 minutes a Saturday morning at the library. Half an hour of darning while the television was on. None of it was demanding. None of it required expertise or education or access to financial advice. It required only the consistent decision to look. The economy that replaced this attention was not a hostile one in any obvious sense. It was not designed to harm. It was designed to make things easier. And in many specific ways, it succeeded. Goods became cheaper. Variety expanded. Shopping became more convenient. And the range of things a working household could reasonably aspire to own widened beyond anything a 1970s kitchen table could have imagined. But the convenience that arrived with all of this was a particular kind of convenience, one that operated by removing the friction that attention had previously inhabited. The auto-renewing subscription removed the friction of deciding each year whether the subscription was still worth it. The estimated bill removed the friction of reading the meter. The supermarket's predictable pricing removed the friction of knowing what things were supposed to cost. The credit card removed the friction of running out of money. In each case, what was removed was not just inconvenience. What was removed was a specific, regular encounter with the reality of where the money was going. And that encounter, however mildly uncomfortable, was where the decisions lived. The 23rd trick, the one that does not belong to any single household, but to all of them, is the act of treating your domestic finances as something that warranted the same attention you gave your employment. Every working person in the 1970s paid close and careful attention to the details of their job: the hours, the rate, the deductions, the rights, the obligations. They read the pay packet, they knew the terms, they kept the records they were given. The households that thrived financially were simply the ones who brought that same quality of attention home through the door at the end of the day and applied it to the jar, the book, the passbook, the cupboard, the seed catalogue, the library card. Not because they had been told to, not because anyone had called it a strategy, simply because attention, once established as a habit, does not stop at the factory gate. You did not necessarily grow up in one of these households. You may not have learned any of these specific habits directly, but you have been in houses where some of them lived. where someone kept a dripping basin or knew their divvy number or went to the end-of-day market. And you noticed the habit, even if you did not name it. Because habits of attention have a quality that makes them visible to anyone paying even a little attention themselves. They are quiet, and they are repetitive, and they produce, over time, results that look nothing like luck. They look like management. They look like a household that has been looked after consistently by someone who decided to look. All 23 are still available. Every one of them still works. The jar, the passbook, the mending basket, the store cupboard, the library card, the annual letter to the tax office. The decision to know what enough means for your specific life, these require nothing that is not already in your possession. What they require is the same thing they always required, the attention, which was always the whole trick. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.